Elara lived where the town of Verdant Rise ended and the unforgiving granite hills began. Her world was a simple one. It was composed of a small, tight-walled cabin built by her father, a lean-to for her aging horse, and the memory of a shame she was too young to fully understand when it was given to her. She had been 10 years old. She had stood before the town council, a slip of a girl with dirt under her nails and eyes that saw the world in ways they could not. She had repeated the words her father had taught her, words he had pulled from the patterns of bark on the oldest trees and the depth of the cracks in the dry season mud. "The creek is getting sick," she had said, her voice a small, clear bell in the dusty council hall. "It will dry up." Mayor Thorne, a man whose family had founded Verdant Rise and who believed the town's name was a permanent promise from God, had chuckled. It was a thick, dismissive sound. He had called it a dangerous lie. He said it was the kind of talk that scared investors and unsettled the good, church-going folk. He said it was born of the wild, ungodly nonsense her father filled her head with. For the crime of speaking a truth they were not ready to hear, she was exiled. Not in chains, but in a way that was colder and more complete. She was declared an outcast, her father's property at the edge of town, her designated prison. Townsfolk were forbidden from trading with her, speaking to her, or acknowledging her existence. Her father died 2 years later, leaving her alone with his legacy. It was not a legacy of land or money. It was a collection of leather-bound journals. Inside, on page after brittle page, was a lifetime of observation. He had recorded the rainfall in inches, the creek's depth in handspans, the migration patterns of the finches, the health of the deep-rooted ironwood trees. He had cross-referenced these notes with older records, town archives, and the half-forgotten almanacs of his own grandfather. A pattern had emerged. It was a terrifyingly simple cycle of 50 years. 50 years of plenty, where the verdant creek ran full and the name of the town seemed an eternal truth. Then, a gradual, almost imperceptible decline. It culminated in a decade of profound drought, a drought so severe it would crack the very bedrock and turn the lush valley into a bowl of dust. According to his calculations, they were entering the final year of the decline. The great thirst was coming. But his journals did not only contain the prophecy of doom. They held the blueprint for survival. He had identified a specific place on their small plot of land. It was a massive outcrop of non-porous granite, shaped by an ancient glacier into a shallow bowl on the surface, with a deep, solid core. His plan was not a well. A well would be useless when the water table fell below the reach of any drill. His plan was a cistern, a colossal, stone-lined cistern dug into the heart of the granite. It would be designed to capture every drop of seasonal runoff, every bit of winter snowmelt, and the slow, patient seepage from the deep, hidden fissures in the rock itself. It was to be a reservoir of life, sealed against the sun and the thirst to come. Elara, now 18, stood before that granite outcrop. She held her father's final journal in her hands. The pages were filled with diagrams, load calculations, and notes on mortar composition. She took a deep breath, the air already feeling thinner, drier than it had a year ago. The time for mourning was over. The time for work had begun. Her first act was to walk into town. It was the first time she had done so in 6 years. The people of Verdant Rise stared. They saw the ghost of the strange little girl, now grown into a lean, weathered young woman, with her father's unnervingly direct gaze. She walked straight to the office of Mayor Thorne. The mayor had grown softer and pinker over the years. He looked at her as if she were a piece of unpleasant news that had been left on his doorstep. "What do you want?" he asked, not bothering with a greeting. Elara placed the open journal on his desk. She pointed to the calculations, to the diagrams of the water cycle. "The drought my father predicted is coming," she said. Her voice was no longer a small bell. It was low and steady, like stones rolling in a riverbed. "I am building a cistern. I need access to the town's heavy-duty block and tackle, and I will need a loan for blasting powder." Mayor Thorne stared at the journal. He did not see science or careful observation. He saw madness. He saw the scribblings of the man he had always considered a fool, now presented by the fool's daughter. He began to laugh. It was the same thick, dismissive sound from 8 years ago, only now it was layered with the self-satisfaction of a man who had been proven right for nearly a decade. "Child," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "The Verdant Creek is a gift from the Almighty. It has never failed us, and it never will. Your father filled your head with paranoid fantasies, and it seems you've let them fester." He pushed the journal back across the desk. "We will not lend you town equipment to engage in this folly. Go home. Pray for a clearer mind." Elara said nothing. She simply closed the journal, turned, and walked out. The story of her request spread through Verdant Rise by noon. It was the best piece of gossip they had enjoyed in years. Silas Croft, the wealthiest rancher in the valley, heard it while overseeing the final touches on his new pride and joy. He had just spent a fortune drilling a new, modern well, deeper than any in the county. It was connected to a gleaming, poured concrete cistern that held 5,000 gallons, a monument to his wealth and foresight. "A hole in the rock," Croft bellowed with laughter to his ranch hands. "She wants to fight the future with a shovel and a bucket, while we have modern engineering on our side." His laughter echoed across his green pastures, pastures irrigated by the seemingly endless supply of water from his new well. Dr. Hemlock heard the news while making his rounds. He was a man of science, a man who believed in what could be seen and measured in conventional ways. A cistern of that design would be a public health menace, he declared at the general store, his voice full of authority. Stagnant water, unfiltered runoff. It would be a breeding ground for cholera and typhoid. The girl is not only mad, she's a danger. The townspeople, comfortable and secure, absorbed the opinions of their leaders. They embraced the mockery. The project was christened Elara's Folly. The name stuck. It became part of the local vernacular. A pointless task became known as digging Elara's hole. A person lost in a daydream was staring at Elara's rock. They called her the Dust Witch, the girl who prayed for drought instead of rain. The children would sometimes creep to the edge of her property, daring each other to get a look at the crazy woman and her big, stupid rock. Elara heard the whispers. She saw the pointing fingers when she made her rare, silent trips to the edge of the woods for things she could not grow or make. She ignored them all. Their noise was the buzzing of flies. The only sounds that mattered were the words in her father's journals and the rhythmic thump of her own heart. And so the work began. Her only companion was Shale, the grey gelding her father had bought as a colt. The horse was old, but his back was strong and his spirit was patient. He was her partner in the solitary labour. The first month was spent clearing the site. She cut down the scrub brush and hauled away the loose rock, her hands quickly blistering, then callousing into thick, tough leather. Then came the breaking of the stone. She did not have the blasting powder she had requested. She had to do it the old way, the slow way. Following the fissures her father had mapped in his journal, she would drill a series of holes with a star drill and a sledgehammer. Strike, turn, strike, turn. The rhythm was brutal, jarring her bones with every impact. It was a sound that carried on the dry air, a steady, metallic heartbeat that the townspeople learned to ignore. Once the holes were drilled, she would hammer in dry wooden wedges. Then she would pour water over them. Overnight, the wood would swell, expanding with a silent, inexorable force. By morning, a new crack would have appeared in the granite. A huge slab of rock would be split from the main body. Then came the hauling. She and Shale, working with a system of levers and rollers, would drag the massive pieces of granite away from the deepening pit. She was not just digging a hole, she was quarrying her own building materials. Each piece of excavated granite was assessed. The flat, strong pieces were set aside for lining the cistern walls. The irregular chunks were destined for the outer retaining wall. The first year passed. The pit was a shallow depression, barely 10 feet across and 5 feet deep. To the town, it looked like a pathetic scar on the landscape. To Elara, it was progress. The spring rains that year were lighter than usual. The verdant creek did not rise as high as it once had. Silas Croft scoffed. "A dry spring," he said to anyone who would listen. "Happens every few years. That's why a man invests in a deep well, not in a mud puddle." The second year, Elara reached the depth her father had specified for the main basin. 20 feet deep, 50 feet in diameter, a massive, concave bowl of solid rock. Now the second phase of the work began, lining the cistern. She built a stone sled, and she and Shale began dragging the quarried slabs back to the pit. This was work that required more than just strength. It required precision. Using her father's notes, she mixed her own mortar from lime, sand, and a specific type of clay she dug from a hidden deposit a mile up the valley. Each stone was cut and shaped to fit snugly against its neighbor. She laid the floor first, a perfectly fitted mosaic of flat stones, each seam sealed with a tenacious mortar. Then she began to build the walls, curving them inward, a masterpiece of dry stone technique reinforced with her father's unique binding agent. The work was slow. It was methodical. It was lonely. Some days her muscles screamed with a fire that made sleep impossible. Some days the sheer scale of the task threatened to crush her spirit. In those moments, she would sit on the edge of the pit, open a journal, and read her father's words. She would trace the lines of his diagrams, feeling the press of his hand through the faded ink. His quiet confidence became her own. He had seen the future. He had drawn the map. All she had to do was walk the path. The second summer was hotter and drier than the last. The Verdant Creek was noticeably shallower. The grass in Croft's pastures was not as green. He had to run his pump for longer each day. The third year, Elara finished lining the main basin. It was a work of art, a silent, subterranean cathedral of grey stone. Now she began the most crucial part of the design, the collection system. Her father had understood that the meager rainfall would not be enough. The true genius of his plan was in harvesting the hidden water. She dug a series of deep, narrow channels, radiating outward from the system. They were not trenches on the surface, but carefully angled tunnels that followed the natural fissures in the bedrock. These channels were designed to intercept the subsurface seepage, the water that moved slowly through the earth long after the rains had stopped. She lined these channels with smaller, smooth stones, creating underground aqueducts that all sloped gently toward the cistern. This was the most dangerous work. She worked in tight, dark spaces, the weight of the earth and rock a constant presence above her. But she was fearless. She trusted her father's engineering. The final element was the lid. A cistern open to the hot sun would lose its precious contents to evaporation. Using the largest, most perfect slabs of granite she had quarried, she constructed a massive, domed roof over the basin. She left only a small, square opening, which she framed with a perfectly cut stone curb. She fashioned a lid from a single, thick slab of granite, so heavy it took all her strength with a lever to move it. The third summer was brutal. For the first time in memory, the town had to institute water rationing for gardens. The Verdant Creek was now a shadow of its former self, a lazy, shallow stream that a child could wade across without getting their knees wet. Mayor Thorne gave a speech in the town square.
"These are trying times," he announced, "but our town was founded on resilience. We must be prudent, but have faith. The rains will come."
No one looked toward the granite hills. No one mentioned Elara's folly. They did not want to think about the girl who had been working day after day for 3 years in preparation for this very moment. As the fourth autumn arrived, Elara saw the final signs. The signs her father had written about in his last journal, under the heading, "The Final Indicators." The squirrels and chipmunks were frantic, gathering seeds and nuts with a desperate, feverish energy she had never witnessed before. The few remaining ironwood trees, whose taproots reached deep into the earth, began to drop their leaves 2 months early. And then, the most ominous sign of all. A profound, unnatural silence fell over the hills. The constant chirp of the crickets, the drone of the insects, the background hum of life. It was gone. The land was holding its breath. Elara knew she was out of time. The cistern was complete. The last autumn rains were a pathetic drizzle, but her collection channels guided every precious drop into the stone basin. A light winter dusting of snow melted and followed the same path. By the start of the new year, the 4th year of her labour, the cistern was approximately 1/3 full. Her father's calculations had predicted this. It would be enough. She stood for a long moment, looking down into the square opening at the cool, dark water below. It was the reflection of her life's work. It was the vindication of her father's wisdom. With a deep sigh, she placed the heavy stone lid over the opening, sealing the water in its stone vault. She considered, for a fleeting moment, walking back into town. She could stand before the mayor one last time. She could warn him, plead with him. But she knew it would be useless. They had named her madness. They had made her a joke. To accept her warning now would be to admit their own foolishness, and they were not yet desperate enough for that kind of humility. So she said nothing. She went back to her cabin, checked the seals on her windows, and laid in an extra supply of firewood. She was ready. The spring of that year never truly arrived. There were no rains. The sky remained a pale, unforgiving blue. The sun, which had once been a source of life, became a malevolent eye in the sky, baking the valley day after day. The Verdant Creek dwindled. By June, it was no longer a creek. It was a series of stagnant pools connected by a trickle of water. By July, the pools were gone. There was only cracked mud and bleached stones where water had once flowed. Panic, for the first time, began to whisper through Verdant Rise, but their leaders reassured them. "This is why we have progress," Mayor Thorne declared. "Mr. Croft's well is deep. It will provide for us all." A strict rationing system was put in place. People lined up with buckets at Silas Croft's ranch, where his pump, powered by a chugging gasoline engine, pulled water from deep in the earth. Croft was a hero. He beamed with pride, a modern saviour dispensing life to the grateful masses. He never missed an opportunity to mock the memory of Elara's folly. "Imagine if we had listened to that crazy girl," he would say, gesturing to his powerful pump. We'd be trying to scoop damp mud from a hole with a spoon right now. The townspeople would laugh, but their laughter was brittle. It was the sound of fear being held at bay. On August 14th, the fear broke through. The sound from Silas Croft's pump house changed. The steady, rhythmic gush of water faltered. It became a cough, a sputter. The water that came out was brown, thick with mud and silt. Then, with a final, dying gasp, the flow stopped completely. There was only the hiss of air. The well was dry. The great water table, the source of every well in the valley, had fallen below the reach of even the deepest, most modern drill. A silence fell over the crowd at the ranch. It was a silence far more profound and terrifying than the one Elara had heard in the hills. It was the sound of hope dying. Croft's 5,000-gallon concrete cistern was empty within 2 days. The town's shallow backup wells had been dry for weeks. Verdant Rise had run out of water. The heat was relentless. Livestock began to die. Gardens withered into grey skeletons. The leaves on the trees turned brown and brittle, falling to the ground in a mockery of autumn. People stayed indoors, curtains drawn, conserving what little moisture was in their own bodies. Dr. Hemlock's clinic began to fill with children suffering from dehydration, their lips cracked, their eyes dull. He had nothing to give them. His own well was dry. The entire apparatus of their civilized life had failed. Their money was worthless. Their social standing was meaningless. Their pride had turned to ash in their mouths. In her small cabin, Elara lived a different reality. Each morning she would walk to the simple iron hand pump she had installed beside her hearth. The pump was connected by a pipe to the great cistern. She would work the handle, and with a few easy strokes, cool, clear water would gush into her bucket. The water was fresh and sweet, filtered by the earth, kept pure by the cold, dark stone. The sound of the storm of thirst raging outside the valley was a distant, muffled hum. She used her water carefully, but not fearfully. She watered shale. She tended her small, hardy garden, which grew in soil she had spent years enriching. Life continued in her small sanctuary, a calm, insulated island in a sea of desperation. On the third day after Croft's well failed, a frantic knocking came at her door. Elara opened it. It was a young woman named Sarah, a woman who had once been one of the loudest to mock her. She was holding a small, listless child in her arms. "Please," Sarah wept, her voice a dry rasp. "My son, he won't wake up. The doctor has no water. Please, I know they call you a witch, but please, if you have any—" Elara did not say a word. She did not say, "I told you so." She did not mention the years of ridicule. She stepped aside, gesturing for the woman to come in. She filled a dipper with cool, clear water from her bucket and held it to the child's lips. The boy, barely conscious, began to drink. Elara then gave a full bucket to the mother. "1 bucket per family, per day," she said, her voice calm and even. "Tell the others." Sarah stared at her, her eyes wide with a mixture of shame and overwhelming gratitude. She nodded, unable to speak, and hurried away. The news spread through Verdant Rise like a wildfire. Elara's folly was not a folly. It was a miracle. Within an hour, a line had formed at her cabin door. It was a silent, somber procession of the humbled. The people she had known only as a crowd of scornful faces now stood before her as individuals, their eyes downcast, their hands holding empty buckets. She worked tirelessly, pulling the handle of the pump, filling bucket after bucket.
She did not speak.
There was nothing that needed to be said. The reality of the situation was apology enough. She saw Dr. Hemlock in the line. His face was pale, his starched collar wilted. When he reached the front, he would not meet her eyes. "I need water for the clinic," he mumbled, his voice thick with shame. "For the children. I was wrong. About everything." "1 bucket per family," Elara repeated, her voice betraying no emotion. "The clinic counts as 1. You may come back tomorrow." She filled his bucket, and he turned away, his shoulders slumped. She had not offered him pity, nor had she offered him scorn. She had offered him water. And in doing so, she had become the leader of Verdant Rise. She organized the rationing with quiet authority. She taught them how to reuse every drop, how to use grey water for the hardiest plants. She showed them which wild roots could be chewed for their moisture. The wisdom her father had poured into his journals, she now poured into the desperate community. The last 2 men to join the line arrived on the 5th day. They were Mayor Thorne and Silas Croft. They looked broken. Their fine clothes were covered in dust. Their faces, once plump with pride and authority, were gaunt with thirst and humiliation. They did not ask for special treatment. They stood at the very end of the long line, their heads bowed, waiting for their turn like everyone else. When Silas Croft finally stood before her, he placed his empty bucket on the ground and looked at her, his eyes full of a shame so profound it was painful to witness. "My concrete cistern. It cracked," he whispered. "The heat. It's useless." He looked at the simple stone cabin, at the hand pump, at the woman he had ridiculed for years. "All my money, all my modern machines. They're worthless," he said. "You built something that lasts. You built it with your own 2 hands." Elara simply nodded and filled his bucket. Mayor Thorne was next. He held his hat in his hands, twisting the brim. "We called you a liar," he said, his voice barely audible. "We cast you out. We mocked you. We were fools. Proud, blind fools." He looked up at her, his eyes pleading. "Can we ever be forgiven?" Elara looked at the long line of her former tormentors, now her dependents. She looked at the parched, cracked earth. "The land doesn't forgive," she said, her voice clear and carrying in the still air. "It only teaches." She filled his bucket and sent him on his way. The drought held for another 2 months. For 67 days, the entire town of Verdant Rise survived on the water from Elara's cistern. And on the 68th day, the sky turned grey. The clouds gathered, thick and heavy, and the rain began to fall. It was a slow, steady, soaking rain that lasted for 3 days. It was the sound of salvation. But no one celebrated. The experience had changed them. They had looked into the face of their own arrogance and had been found wanting. A week after the rains returned, a town meeting was called. The entire population gathered in the square. This time, Elara was not an outcast standing before them. She was given the seat of honor at the front. Mayor Thorne, Silas Croft, and Dr. Hemlock stood before the townspeople.
"We have a confession and an apology to make,"
Mayor Thorne began, his voice shaking. He recounted the day, years ago, when a 10-year-old girl had tried to warn them. He spoke of his pride, his dismissal, his foolish belief that their prosperity was guaranteed. Silas Croft spoke next. He confessed his arrogance, his faith in money and machines,
over the wisdom of the earth. He admitted that his expensive well had been a monument to his own ego.
Dr. Hemlock admitted his own intellectual pride, how he had used the language of science to dismiss something he did not understand. Finally, all three men turned to face Elara.
"We were wrong," Mayor Thorne said, his voice ringing with the clarity of a man stripped of all pretense. "And you, Elara, were right. We are sorry. We are deeply and profoundly sorry." The entire town was silent, waiting for her response. Elara stood up. She did not speak of forgiveness. She did not speak of the past. She spoke of the future. "My father taught me to listen to the land," she said. "He taught me that survival is not about pride. It is about preparation. It is not about bending nature to our will, but about understanding its patterns and finding our place within them." She held up one of her father's journals. "The knowledge is here," she said. "I will teach you." And she did. The rebuilding of Verdant Rise was not a return to the way things were. It was a transformation.
The first project, undertaken by the entire community, was the construction of a second cistern, a twin to Elara's on the other side of the valley. Silas Croft donated his land and his money, and he worked on the digging crew, his hands blistering and callousing, just as Elara's had. The phrase, "digging Elara's hole," was reborn. It no longer meant a pointless task. It now meant to act with uncommon foresight, to prepare for hardship with wisdom and humility. It was the highest compliment one could pay a neighbor. When we silence those who warn us of truths we do not wish to hear, we are not punishing them. We are punishing our own future. Elara lived for another 60 years. She never married. She never moved from her father's cabin. She did not become the mayor or hold any official title, but she was the undisputed soul of the town. She never fully rejoined their social circles. The years of isolation had shaped her into a creature of solitude. But her door was always open. The children of Verdant Rise grew up making regular pilgrimages to her cabin. She taught them how to read the clouds, how to understand the language of the trees, how to know the difference between a healthy stream and a dying one. She taught them from her father's journals, ensuring his wisdom would never again be forgotten. She died peacefully in her sleep at the age of 86. The entire town, and the generations that had sprung from it, mourned her passing. They did not bury her in the town cemetery. They laid her to rest on the hill beside her cabin, overlooking the great stone cistern that had saved them all. They did not erect an ostentatious monument. Instead, they affixed a simple bronze plaque to the heavy stone lid of the cistern. The plaque read, "Here lies the water that saved a town, and nearby lies the woman who taught us to listen." She was right.